Hi everyone. Welcome to the end. Welcome to, technically, Book 2, Night 30 of the Orphan's Tales Live quarantine reading series. But in actuality, it is the finale. It is the last. We are at the end of 1,027 pages and 7.5 months of reading and storytelling and laughing and crying and saying my intro and outro an absurd number of times and assuring you all this isn't an audiobook when it is, over and over and over again for this whole mad time. Hello, Catherynne, reporting from Los Angeles. And some of you know that this is a hard reading to do tonight, but the show must go on. I'll get to that in a minute. I really am grateful to everybody who has been a part of this, even if you've only dropped in for one night and you're not caught up, and it doesn't matter. It's just it's been a really special thing to be a part of, to have somewhere to be and a reason to put on makeup. Some of you have been around long enough to remember we were doing this every night in spring and early summer, not twice a week. It's been quite a journey. And honestly, I'm not sure I've ever heard of anything like this. All the real celebrities gave up on their little "we're all in this together" events a long time ago. But I never give up. And it's been really powerful for me. I hope it's meant something to you. I know that I will look back on this and I will remember the little frame of this wallpaper, and my ring light, and all of the tweets, and it will be a sense memory to remember this time when I hope things are better. This won't be the end of readings. I'll figure out something else, but this is the end of this, and it is the end of the Orphan's Tales. This epic that I wrote when I was much younger, which was in some sense a letter to Santa, a letter to the universe to ask for a better life, which I did eventually get. So it's still a wish letter to the universe for a better life, for better than what we're going through right now. And some of you follow me on Twitter and you know that my father-in-law passed away last night. He was a really wonderful man, and he came to every reading that I did in Australia, even though he didn't have to. And he's never been without mobility issues, but he always came. So this reading tonight, and in some sense, all of them, are for Michael, who told me I could call him Dad more or less the day we met, and has been so kind to me and so fatherly to me for so long. I miss him, and I wish he weren't gone. I'm going to try and keep it together tonight. I don't make any promises. We already saw me crying last week, so I'm a giant softie. It may seem prickly on the outside sometimes when I'm mad about politics, but I have a core of just nougat and marshmallow and weak, vulnerable, absolutely defenseless heart. So I don't promise that I'm not going to cry. I cried when I was writing the end of this book. I have cried the first time I read it out loud. I cried the next time I read it out loud. I've never gotten through it without crying, so I know that will happen. That's not even a question. I will try to keep it together, talking about other things. And I will do my absolute best to be a professional. And I'm trying to deal with the music. There we go. That was on to Fairyland. That skips like 10 years of dramatic plot development. So yeah, I'm trying to hold it together for you guys. So, one last time, let's do the intro. We can talk when it's all over. There's only like 18 pages left, I think. But I thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this with me, for caring about my stories, for being you, for being here, for making it through this year, God, as best as we can. Thank you, Talon. So one of the people watching tonight is the Sarah to whom these books are dedicated, which is one way of knowing that life is a huge circle. And sometimes when you think you've lost people, you haven't. Oh, I'm doing a great job keeping it together. All right. I'm doing the thing, the reality TV thing. I have glasses on. That doesn't help at all. Okay. One last time. As always, for legal reasons, this is not an audiobook of The Orphan's Tales. This is a play. A 7.5-month, one-woman show. Oh, the show ran forever. You can find music, including what we just listened to, Firebird's Child, based on these books at sjtucker.com. You can find copies of them anywhere books are sold, but I would ask you to patronize your local independent bookseller via their web portal or their physical store. If you would like to support mine, it is printbookstore.com in Portland, Maine. You can find me ever after on Twitter at Cat Valente. You can find me on Patreon at Cat Valente and subscribe there for all kinds of content throughout every month. You can ask me anything you like after the reading is done. It does work best if you think of what you might like to ask before I finish, so we don't have any dead air, especially since I suspect this one might go long and Instagram kicks us off after 60 minutes. You can catch up in the archive, and these will stay up in the archive as long as YouTube does, at Cat Valente Live on YouTube. And if you would like to support readings like this, my other work, and my family, my home, and my baby, and my cat, you can put something in the tip jar, which is on my Instagram profile, my YouTube profile, and my website, which is CatherynneValente.com. Thank you so much, Kate, for tipping me this last week. This has been a huge amount of work, but incredibly rewarding. I plan to never wear makeup again. And I am deeply grateful to anyone and everyone who has put a coin in the witch's hat. You have helped this family get through 2020, the year from hell. And without you, we couldn't have. So thank you so much. Here we go. Let me have a little sip of my drink, which is cucumber and lime vodka and watermelon bubbly tonight. Okay, if you're following along at home, we are on page 493, which means that there are exactly 18 pages left. And here we go. Thanks, everyone. The Tale of the Cattle Merchant and the Apple. Every poor lost creature of Urim knows this tale. Gathers round this pale casket in hope so hot and bright it would burn any who did not know Urim itself flames with such hope that you can look nowhere in the city without being blinded. Long ago, there was a man with 3 daughters. This man lived in a country which bordered a sea so salty it foamed white on the sand, a country full of rich grass and cloudy skies. This man was a cattle merchant, and as all merchants did in those days, he traveled often to Shadukiam to trade. On one such occasion, when he was in need of such sundries as merchants long for, cloth, jewels, food, which could not dream of growing in their own countries, he asked his daughters what they would like from the great city. "A dress which shines as brightly as the last moon of winter," cried the first daughter, who was called Ubalda, and who loved such things. "A golden ball as lovely and round as the first sun of summer," cried his second daughter, who was called Ushmila. He frowned at her for a long time before he agreed. "If it please you, father," said his blushing third daughter, who was called Urim, "I should like an apple." "No more," said the merchant, who had certainly not raised his daughters to ask for such silly, simple things. A merchant expects certain tastes from his children, and he was mightily disappointed. "No more," answered the girl, whose hair was very red as the rarest salamander hide, and whose eyes were very blue as the most costly dolphin skin. "Very well," said the merchant, and went in search of the meager fortunes which Shadukium grants to foreigners, enough to snare them, but never enough to make them stay. Now, as often befalls merchants with one meek daughter and two haughty, fortune did not smile on the cattle merchant. He drove his flock before him, sheep of such fleeces as your mother might have heard of in the oldest stories she knew. And when he crossed into Shadukium, he was promptly set upon by minor city officials and relieved of his livestock. His throat bled out into the barrel like sheep cut for supper, and we would weep for him, save that we have quite enough to do with weeping for our own misfortunes. As the cattle merchant's body lay drifting into steam below turrets of diamond and bowers of roses, its blood called, as it might, to a shark, and as the moon rose milk thick and silent, one of her children approached. He was very tall, and thin as a length of paper. His skin and cloaks were the color of the moon, not the romantic lover's moon, but the true lunar geography, gray and pockmarked, full of secret craters, frigid peaks, and blasted expanses. His eyes had no color in them, save for a pinpoint pupil like a spindle's wound. The rest was pure milk moon white. He bent over the slaughtered cattle merchant and smiled. "Perhaps you have heard of the Yi. We envy them. How much we would like to shed our bodies when they shrivel to pockmarks and craters, but we cannot." The man dressed in the moon stepped into the cattle merchant's body like another man steps into his winter coat, and he walked away warm and snug in this new face. And as the Yi are perverse, it amused him to drive the merchant's cart out of the city of Shadukium with a dress as bright as the last moon of winter, a golden ball as lovely and round as the first sun of summer, and an apple, a simple, silly apple. He remembered these things in the bones of the cattle merchant's legs and in the veins of his fingertips. His daughters greeted him with kisses and exclamations of delight, for he kept a scarf at his throat, and his skin was still more or less whole and pink. The slight gray pallor they ignored, as daughters eager for presents will. He gave Ubalda her dress of deep blue and silver, and Ushmila her golden ball, and urged her to run along and play. And he produced, with a flourish, the silly, simple apple, for pretty little Urim, with her red hair like foreign suns, and her blue eyes like foreign seas. "But father, this is not an apple," said the girl, her sweet brow furrowing. "Ah, but in Shadukium, that is called an apple," the man dressed in the moon crooned. It was a ruby, as deep and darkly shaded as a true apple, and at its ebony stem was an emerald leaf thin enough to flutter in the wind. "How shall I eat it, father?" Urim said. "Put your teeth into it, girl, like a wolf biting into a reindeer's cheek." And so the girl did. It tasted, she said, of brandy and cider and the reddest berries she had ever known. And because she was a good child, she shared the fruit with her sisters, and all of them agreed it was lovely, and their father the best of all possible fathers. They ate only half, and kept the rest for the dreary winter. But foreign produce does not often sit well with the provincial daughters of cattle merchants, and the girls sickened, the jewels in their stomachs prickling at their flesh, refusing to dissolve. And all the while they sickened, Their father grew gray and silver and pockmarked, frozen peaks appearing on his cheeks, craters on his arms, and his eyes grew white, white as the salt sea of their home. Now the daughters of this man, though weak of digestion, were not weak of will, and between them were wise enough to know their father was not their own, and that Shadukium, as often as it gives, takes and takes and takes. Ushmila was over fond of books, and she saw the marks of the Yi on her father. Ubalda was over fond of sharp things, scissors and knives and diamonds, and brought her collection to her sisters. It was decided that Urim of the red hair like apple skins and blue eyes like moonlight would discover the truth of the matter, and so the clever child brought her father the uneaten half of the Shaduki apple, jeweled and wet. "Father, I am sick and close to death," said Urim, her face pale as wasting. The man dressed in the moon smiled hungrily. "How wonderful," he said. "Surely you do not mean that, Papa," cried Urim. "Of course not, my darling. Forgive an old man. His mind runs away without him sometimes." Urim cast her eyes down and mourned her father. "Will you not share this apple with me? It would comfort me in my dying, for though it hurts me so, I have never tasted anything so sweet." The man dressed in the moon's face softened as much as it might, for he believed well in the greed of young girls, and he folded her into his arms. "It would delight me, my darling daughter." Urim cut a slice of apple for the pocked Yi, and he chewed it with the relish of an alligator sucking the bones of a finch. But soon enough he began to cough and choke, for Urim had poisoned her for an apple, and the daughters of the cattle merchant, Ubalda and Ushmila, rushed from the shadows and leapt upon the gray-skinned creature, cutting into him over and over, but never enough to kill. They had no griffin's talon and could not hope for death. Urim sliced his cheeks with the faceted edges of her apple, grinning wildly into the face that had once been her father's. "Never, let it never be said," she cried, "that the daughters of a cattle merchant do not know how to put an animal down." The tale of the leprous and the leopard continued. They were as clever as a pack of hyenas, those girls, the wicker white said. They did not kill the Yi, but opened his skin and took the thinnest shavings of his bones. How they must have shone like the shards of the moon itself, and these Urim instructed them to place on their tongues. The bones melted to vapor, and the girls were healed, the sharp apple jewels in their bellies melting to nothing. And Urim, wise child, kept her father barely alive, collecting his blood in the glass jars they used for sheep's milk, and put his body into a casket of white stone. She nodded at the memorial. A city grew around this casket, on the edge of the white and salted sea, and when folk were in need, shavings were carefully taken from his bones and placed on their tongues, and the casket sealed up again. After 100 years, the man dressed in the moon stopped screaming. The wicker white looked down ashamed. Urim, named for that clever girl who wanted only an apple, became famous. More and more came. I came. My branches were drier than the skull of a lion left in the waste when I finally arrived at the gates. My skin was gone. All that remains was what you see. How this came to pass is not important. It is the beginning of illness ever remembered so clearly as its boils and blood and broken, aching bones. The moment when you breathe your last clear air, one never remembers that. I am afflicted, so are we all. When first I came, I was sure that Urim would hold me in its black-clothed embrace, look on me with her gray and mothering eyes, and brush my brow with her lips. She would give me an apple and a shaving of bone. I would walk from her whole. But there are so few cures in Urim these days. The Yi's bones are not infinite. They are precious, and we do not all deserve them. I yawned. Of course, my mistress deserved all things. "Will you wait with us for the dawn?" I asked the poor, empty woman. "Of course," she said. I have told you what happened. The dawn came. Black-robed lepers came hobbling on canes of ash and hazel, having heard that one of their number had arrived, and they embraced us as sisters. Their hands safe on ruins' veils, they told us we were loved, that flowers would be rubbed into our wounds, that there were altars ready for our knees. If we were fortunate, if we were worthy, perhaps we would be granted a sliver of bone. A leper with one leg reached out to cup Ruin's face in his rotted hands, his eyes alight with joy. He said, "There are no veils in Urim, dear. Show us your affliction. We do not care for beauty here." With a stifled cry of relief, Ruin pulled her veils from her face, and with it came peels of skin like pages torn from a book, and the lepers recoiled. "You are not a leper," one cried, covering her mouth with one putrid hand, green mold springy and thick in the webbing of her fingers. "She's dead," whispered the first. "She's dead, already dead. Her death will spread among us like plague." A third, his nose a crusted red gape in his face, hissed, "She shall not have the bones. They are ours. She cannot have them." And a fourth wondered if she were not ye herself, with bones, more bones for their tongues. Lepers know well not to touch the sick. They embraced her, thinking her like them. But they could not risk contracting whatever other vile illness she bore. They beat her with their canes and slashed her out her tongue, so that she could not give their names to the night. The tale of the waste concluded. I snarled and leapt and tried to bite them, but I am only a cat. I was not raised to hunt, only to walk with her in the waste. Rend raised a paw over her eyes. It chained me to her, so that my thrashing would only harm my mistress, and left us battered against the white casket. They took her tongue gingerly in gloved hands to see if it could be boiled into medicine. After a long while, she stirred as if dreaming, and I pulled her from the city. She is dead. She did not bleed. I am as near to dead as makes no difference among leopards. I did not bleed. The silver chain suits us, we find. We are bound, she and I, and now we go home to Ajanab, where there are red spices and no cures, where she may lie down again in the earth and rest, and I may mourn my mother. When she has gone to stone entirely, I shall carry her upon my back into the city, and place her before the house of red spices, and sparrows shall live in her hair, and I shall live in her feet. Ruin wept, and in her tears tiny specks of flesh washed away. Rend looked at her with huge black eyes full of feline grief. The djinn looked at the black-veiled woman as well, her red eyes dim with despair. "I cannot give you back your tongue," Skald said slowly, her hair clearing from her flaming face. "But I could heal you." She cleared her burning throat. "Well, I could try. My wishing days are done, the Kaigal saw to that. But if you would free me, I could try." "How could we open such a cage?" the leopard said. "I suspect that if your mistress were to touch the bars, they would turn to stone, and could be as easily broken as any other stone." "And what would you do if we were to set you free?" The leopard clawed the ground uncertainly. Skald looked into the east, across the cracked earth with its ruined gold and scurrying mice. Kohinoor was right. I am old now, nearly 14. I have not long left. I would go home to Ajanab and converse with my friend Spider, dance with the sirens, and burn in Lantern's tail. Let my hand fall once or twice on Solace's hair. I would watch the carnival and listen to Agrafena every morning as the sun graces her bows. I would see how my wives have got on. I would tell Aur such a story, such a story. The Djinn Queen closed her fire-rimmed eyes. I would swim in the Vareni and hear the bells ring out, and when I was done, I would put my cheek to Simeon's fingers and rest. Tears flooding her rheumy eyes, Ruin raised her arms and threw back her black cowl. Beneath it was sparse hair and skin like shavings of bone. Her skull showed through the black strands, and her cheeks were hollow, translucent. She was made of glass which was fainting back into sand. Her mouth was dry and white and chapped, and though she opened it, no sound came. She reached out with both hands toward the cage, and as her fingers grazed the gin bones, the bone bars flushed red and porous, basilisk bright. Wordless laughter erupted from Ruin's broken mouth, and it mingled with her wrenching cries. The cage shivered red at the end of all things, as red as Ruin's house, her shoes, her father. And as she released the bars, Skald put her incandescent palms to them, and they sloughed to molten white. The djinn emerged, her smoke hair spreading free around her with no baskets to contain it, like spilled water. "What will you do to her?" whispered the cat nervously, inching close to her mistress. "My darling cat," the djinn smiled. "I shall breathe into her and bring her to life. There is no stone that cannot be rendered like the fat of a cow in a fire, if the fire is only hot enough." "Will it hurt her?" Wren's spotted, gold-furred head lolled anxiously on the earth. "Very much, I'm afraid." Skald drew a long breath, and the desert seemed to shimmer into her. Her chest cracked, and beneath the black skin embers flushed bright as two suns, then in her arms and her cheeks, and how she blazed then! Her face puffed and ready, her breath held, her painted palms phosphorescent. She blew out her breath, and the wind and fire of it was white as a star at the center of a city, engulfing Ruin in light. Wren cowered and scrabbled away, singeing her tail. Ruin burned, a red candle in the blasted waste, and even after Skald had wheezed and coughed her last flames, the dead girl stood with her arms raised to the sky, her flesh peeling off in blazing strips like the ash that floats from a summer bonfire, and it was hours before she stopped. Once, in the wasteland between Urim and Ajanab, 3 long shadows were cast on the thirsty earth, whose dark cracks forked out in all directions like vines searching for the smallest trickle of water. 3 long shadows lay black and severe on that fractured desert. A woman, a djinn, and a leopard stared at each other over the golden earth, and the woman fell to her knees, her body burned and pink and blistered, but whole and new. Her hair was burned away, her bald head shone in the last rays of the sun, and she put her living, blood-bright hands to her soft belly and screamed into the ground, screamed and wept and laughed. In the garden. It was nearly dawn. A ghostly blue light lay on the children, stippled with stars. Long shadows lay on the snow, and the fires had gone out in the center of the garden. The braziers at the gate had guttered to smoking embers. The courtiers wandered back into the palace, full of rhinoceros horn and cinnamon wine, dogs with bells on their collars leaping at their mistresses' hems. The laces which held the chestnut boughs in the shape of a chapel were loosed, and sprang back with red-barked relief into their accustomed fork-bowed shapes. The wood beyond the gate was dark and deep, and in it nightingales and starlings sang, pecking in the snow in search of the sun. The lake with its frozen reeds was still as the world becomes before dawn, a hesitant hare testing the ice for thickness with its forepaw. The boy and the girl sat together, huddled for warmth. The world before dawn is very still, also very cold, and it seemed as though everything had been conquered by blue, even the girl's shivering lips. "That is all," the boy said. "There's no more." The girl opened her eyes, her hair wet with melted snow, her scarlet gown black in the dark. "That was a wonderful story," she said, a smile opening like a lily on her face. The boy frowned, his face suddenly grown up and very serious. and there will be no others, no more strange and no more wonderful. It is over. The girl touched his face gently, putting her cold hands on his cheeks. Do you wish you had never asked me that day why my eyes are dark, like the lake before the dawn? No, but I thought something would happen. There would be lightning and thunder, or a terrible pillar of smoke, and something dreadful would come out. I don't know, the girl said. I never knew what would happen. Maybe, the boy whispered eagerly, maybe nothing will happen. I can come to you every day until I am sultan, and then you can come to me in the palace and sit at my table without a veil. The girl shut her eyes, and the vast blackness of her lids glinted in the blue snowlight. No letters moved on them. They were dark and smooth and empty, no more than a mark now, no more than ink. An owl flew overhead, home from a night of hunting. Perhaps, the girl said. There is always a moment when stories end. A moment when everything is blue and black and silent, and the teller does not want to believe it is over. The listener does not. So they both hold their breath and hope as fervently as pilgrims that it is not over. There are more tales to come, more and more, fitted together like a long chain coiled in the hand. They hold their breath, and the trees hold theirs, and the air, the ice, and the wood, and the gate. But no breath can be held forever, and all tales end. The girl opened her eyes. Even mine. Yes, my dear, even yours, said a gentle, rough voice, like the feathers of a goose's wings rubbing together. The girl turned and saw, on the other side of the gate, on the other side of the wrought iron battle with its cannons of ice, a bent old woman with tangled silver hair and a long hooked nose. The girl caught her breath like a fawn in sight of a wolf, and her hands began to tremble. You are here. You are here to judge me, she said, her throat dry. That would be a rather severe interpretation, said the crone with a sly grin. The girl's great dark eyes filled up with tears, glittering like snowflakes in the firelight. She bit her lip. Am I good? She blurted. Was I good enough? Am I a good girl? I'm not wicked, like the spirit said. I tried so hard not to be wicked, or angry, or bitter, even when the night was very cold. The crone tucked a silver strand of hair behind her ear. Do you remember me? She asked, as though she had not heard anyone speak. The girl dried her eyes with the heels of her hands. Yes, she said, you came when I was little as one of my brown-backed geese. You told me about the tales, and you gave me my knife. The girl drew it out of her crimson dress, the small, curving silver knife with its handle of bone. The old woman nodded. It is my knife, but it was better that you have it. You were more often hungry than I. Please, the girl said. How does it end? I've waited so long. The old woman wound her hands in the dead, dry rose roots of the gate. Oh, my darling girl, she whispered, her voice thick. I know you have. The last tale. Once, there was a fairy on a lonely grey lake, on a lonely grey shore. It creaked in the storms and the wind, and its tether stretched. A man with a hunch on his back pulled it back and forth, clothed all in rags. Once there was a lonely island on a lonely lake, and on that lonely island was a woman with green scales glittering on her skin. And she walked the shore, and the eyes that blinked on the grey lakeside wept for her. But the woman did not weep. She wrung her fingers and looked into the mist and considered many things, for her mind was as vast as the lake itself. From time to time a young man with red skin like fine wood came to find her and stroke her green-black hair. She could not be consoled, and finally stepped onto the cracked boards of the dock and opened her throat to call the ferry. She called until her voice died on the wind, dry as molten skin. "Please," she called, "please come back." It did not concern the ferryman if the lake folk needed him, but he could not help but hear the snake woman's cries, and when the day's storms had passed, leaving his bones wet and his lizards irritable, he let the ferry drift as it wanted to. For sometimes in his loneliness the man believed the ferry was as alive as he, and he spoke to it and listened to its troubles, which had mostly to do with barnacles and algae. But the ferry now spoke of a voice pulling at it like a pole, and it longed to go toward that voice, that snake song which flicked its tongue at the poor ferry in the fog. They floated out to the island with the beach of eyes, and there was the woman with her glittering green skin, her long hair wet and plastered to her hips, her eyes dark and needful. "I want to see her," she said, before the ferryman had finished his docking. "That is impossible." "No, it is not. You ferry anyone, if they pay the toll, and I will pay. In the world, in the sun, in the blood-riddled world, my daughter is breathing and eating her breakfast with a golden fork and laughing at a joke the cook has told her. I want to see her." The woman's eyes softened with depthless pleading. "Just once." "And what do you think you can pay?" "You took the Huldras' tail." "I did." "Will you take my hair?" The ferryman considered. He did not wish to. It was not right, and not his habit. But he should perhaps have refused the child in the first place, and to become priggish now seemed useless and small. The tolls these days were strange, and he had seen more tolls than he had ever seen years in the world. He thought perhaps he had tired of them, the endless coins, and these late grotesque amputations. "I will take it," he said slowly, his voice echoing not at all in the thick fog. "But you must agree to my terms." The woman waited, her green a scream of desire in the grey. "I will take your hair as 2 tolls across and back. You may not go as the goose woman went into the world to live and eat bread and dance. You must come back. You are not like her. Go to your child, just once, and return to me, to the lonely lake and the lonely shore. That is all that is right and proper." The woman nodded and gathered her long, shimmering, green-black hair into her hand. With the sharp edge of the ferryman's wing bones, she severed it at her neck and stepped aboard the ferry. It sighed under her, glad in what ways nails and wood can be glad. They drifted into the lake, and Zemaya looked back toward the shore, where 2 young men with red skin like a ship's hull stared after the dwindling raft. She raised her hand, and the mist closed over her. She stood above her daughter's crib. It was a beautiful room, with a fire in the marble hearth and a bottle of hot wine on a little glass table. The crib was cedar, and the blankets were pure and white as a dove's belly. The little girl had a shock of dark hair, and her red fingers were curled into fists, her tiny brow furrowed as she dreamed. Zemaya opened the window so that the light of the stars could stream in, the light of the moon, the dark of the sky. Dappled silver light fell onto the child's face. "Sorrow," she whispered. "Sorrow, my love." Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of light, of snake light and starlight. Zemaya lit the room like a brazier, her silver self spilling into the corners. She had not known such light in her skin since before the Boar King had taken her. It filled up her throat so that she could not breathe. She had forgotten what it felt like to be so bright. She knelt by the crib, her jagged, shorn hair dripping light like blood, and smiled at her daughter. She wanted to stay after all. She wanted to put a veil over her hair and take this child downstairs to the spinning world of the court and watch her grow up. She wanted to make sure that the moon and stars were always on her. She wanted to hold her child to her as she had done on the lonely island and feel her living mouth tug at her breast. Slowly, Zemaya reached out a glowing finger and with infinite care caressed her daughter's eyelids, the first and last touch of the star and her daughter in this lakeless world. The skin beneath her finger curled black and steaming, and shadows leapt from the smoking flesh. Sorrow began to cry. A nurse came bustling in, and Zemaya stepped into the shadows and the starlight, chagrined. Once, there was a ferry on a lonely grey lake on a lonely grey shore. It creaked in the storms and the wind, and its tether stretched. A man with a hunch on his back pulled it back and forth, clothed all in rags. He saw a woman walking along the shore toward him, her hair short and unkempt, her eyes red with weeping. She came to the ferry and looked up at him stonily. I only wanted to touch her, with living hands, my living child, just once. Was it enough? The ferryman asked. Zemaya was a long time answering. Yes, she said finally, and stepped onto the ferry once more. Out of the garden. What she left on your eyelids, sorrow, my dove, my darling, my little goose, said the old woman, was your history, winding and tangling back and back and back. It was your story, the story of your birth, your life, swinging forward and backward like a holy censer, the tendrils of its smoke reaching out and around and into each other like the coils of a snake, pursuing all those strange and varied folk with a star's tenacity. They are the tales of everyone who reached into silver shadows and pulled you into this world. Your mother, who was a murdered star. Your father, a lonely creature who loved a raft that became a tree, and a tree that became a red ship. A tea leaf that found its way out of the world and quickened in a dead woman's womb. And the girl who carried it there. The boy who paid your fare across the water. The women who pushed your mother back from death. The basilisk 3 women mutilated to speak once more before they died. The bear who was turned back. The flame-hearted djinn who was born from your eyelids burning beneath your mother's hand, who drifted into the world just before you. Crone smiled, her face breaking into wrinkles, her eyes spilling with tears. And perhaps not least, the woman who carried you on the ferry, who was once a goose, who took a child away from her cradle and far away and left you instead, a magpie's trick, who watched over you and gave you a knife to keep you from hunger, and safe, her own knife, the one she used to kill a wizard when she was very, very young. Your name is Sorrow, my little bird, my dearest diamonds, and you have been loved all your days. The girl could not breathe. She coughed and wept and crumbled into the snow. Harry opened the gate and took the girl into her arms. She stroked her hair, she whispered to her, and dried her tears. The boy watched, his mouth open, trying to remember every tale and losing them as quickly as they rose up in his heart. Golden fish that could not stay. Out of the wood, a young girl came. She was very beautiful. She wore a wispy red dress that seemed made for dancing. All along her right side ran stark tattoos, a dancing black flame. Beside her were a great firebird, a black smoking djinn, and a small brown spider with glittering legs. The young girl walked slowly to Sorrow, who untangled herself from Airy and stood to face her. Solace touched the girl's eyes softly and looked out into the white-hushed garden. So this is where I would have lived, if I had not become a firebird's daughter, she said. Did you like it? Sorrow blushed. No, she whispered. It was cold at night. I think I have paid for your fire with my sadness since we were born. Solace grew very serious. I'm sorry. She folded the other girl into her dancer's arms and kissed her cheeks. They looked so much alike, the boy thought, standing like that with their faces buried in one another's shoulders, all that long black hair mingling. But now we will be sisters, Solace said brightly, brushing Sorrow's hair from her face, and you will learn to dance with me, I promise. The djinn floated forward, and Sorrow could see in her eyes how old she was now, the ancient guttering fire. She was still as youthful-looking as any flame, her stomach taut and black, her palms gleaming, but she was so tired. I think, she said, one red eyebrow arched, that you are somehow my mother, at least as much as you are her sister. Airy has tried to explain it, but I was never good at history. But it would seem I am the only djinn of seared flesh, and that is something to know before one is blown out. Why did you leave me for so long? Sorrow cried, unable to contain herself. I was so alone. I was so frightened. You could have come for me any time. Why did you wait? Airy regarded her solemnly. The world is wide, and the rearing of children is a delicate thing. But heart of my heart, I knew, and from her skirts she drew a long golden feather, that all tales end, and I and all would be here when it was time for yours to begin. Come with us, said Solace. I'm afraid, Sorrow said. I've never been outside the gate, ever. I've wished for it so many times, but I'm afraid. Airy bent, took the girl's dark face in her hands. Her laughing eyes were black as a bird's. Sorrow, come. Come into the world, into the land beyond wishing, where I swear to you there are miracles, a multitude of griffins, and papas at prayer, and lost girls found, and a satyr laughing in a cottage by the sea. Solace turned to Lantern, and the two shared a glittering, conspiratorial expression. The spider said nothing, but clicked her silver legs together. He turned and let a long glistening cloak fall from his back, and Solace caught it. She wrapped her sister's shivering shoulders in a cloak of golden feathers and arranged her hair over its collar. Come, she said, I will show you so many strange and wonderful things. The boy squeaked. He had meant to make a much more grown-up sound, but it came out a squeak. He did not know what he wanted. He did not know what to say. But his face was stricken, his mouth trembling. He tried valiantly not to cry. You were not always alone, he managed to say. Not always. And the girl, his girl, looked at him for a long time. As still and strange as she had ever been, her dark eyes showing stark as the first pale light that tipped the trees like snow. She stood there, her hand clasped tight in Solace's painted hand, a djinn at her shoulder, a firebird at her back, a spider at her feet, and an old grandmother with her hand resting on her shoulder. And we have just that. He wanted to run to her, but he dared not. He did not belong. He knew that he did not belong with them. He would be sent back to the palace to sit alone on a hard throne. But as the sun rose up like a pearl in the winter sky, Sorrow looked at the boy, her boy, and smiled, her face as bright as feathers. "Tell me a story," she said. "Tell me the tale of how we met when we were young. How we walked in a garden and you were not afraid of me. How we went into the world and learned even more strange and wonderful things than we could have guessed at when our walls were made of flowers. Tell me a tale I have never heard, with a boy and a girl in it, and a long, wide road." Sorrow held out her pale, thin hand, shining in the morning like a promise. The boy looked back over his shoulder at the palace, but only once. He laced his fingers into hers. As they walked into the wood, lanterns sang out the morning. Behind them, in the golden light of a scalding sun, a purple bracelet slowly sank into the snow. The end. I'm sorry if people have lag, but that is the end of the Orphan's Tales. And that was how I met your mother. Does anyone have any questions? It's a lot there at the end, certainly. I was talking in the last stream about how this book is so very much about how lost a little girl I was, and how I kept slipping through the cracks of having a family, and in so many ways, by the time I had finished writing it, I had found my people, my kindred, my tribe. But now, 18 years down the road, I'm not an orphan anymore. I have my family and I have my tribe, and I had a wonderful man in Australia who let me call him Dad, and all the people in between. And it was a good story. I'm sorry your cat is concerned about you crying. I can't judge on that, as I could barely get through that at certain points. I mean, the funny thing is, the reason you guys had lag is my sister called. My sister called as I would, my actual sister called. I do all of these just on my phone, and my sister called as I was reading the end of that story. Because sometimes the world is a story all its own. Byron's doing fine. My cat, who's been very ill, is doing much better. He's waiting for me to come back upstairs to the bedroom where I must live forever now. And he's a very happy boy. All his numbers are back up to normal, and as far as anyone can tell, he'll live a good long life. Thanks to all of you. Heath says he's petting Lord Byron right now. I don't know if she's still watching, but the girl who was just a small girl at the time and is a much bigger girl now, who I wrote this originally for and dedicated to Sarah. That last apple stories actually came from a bit from her childhood as well, when she was very little. I think she was 3 or 4. they asked her what she wanted for Christmas, and she wanted an apple. So they got her an apple tree and planted it in the back garden. And just that odd little thing stuck in my head for so long. I ended up turning it into a story, because everything gets turned into a story sooner or later, not just if you happen to know a writer, but we all turn into stories eventually. How does it feel looking back at that snapshot of your life now that so much has changed? And there she is, remembering her apple. See, I remember your whole life, Sarah. How does it feel? It's so strange. It really is. It's so strange. Sometimes I feel very connected to that girl, and it feels like a girl. Just, God, I was a baby. I was a baby writing that book. And sometimes I feel like it was yesterday, and no time at all has passed between who I was then and who I was now, even though, I lost people and gained people, and I live as far as I could possibly live in America from where I lived for part of writing it, and then as far from Japan as you can imagine. And I wrote bits of the Orphan's Tales in God, I mean, if we add it all up, in Japan, Scotland, Virginia, Ohio, California, it's a trip around the world, writing that book. And it was so much my life, and so much trying to be older than I was, trying to be younger than I was, trying to be good. I just wanted to be good at something. I wanted to write a good book. Just trying so hard, striving, the way you do when you're that young and you just want something so badly. And I guess what I wanted most was to not be an orphan. I didn't want to be that girl in the garden anymore. I wanted people. I wanted people. And now that I'm in quarantine, I still want people. Have you ever been tempted to dip back into that universe and write more Orphan's Tales? Not really. Honestly, no. I'm not saying that I never would, but I haven't. It's 1,000 pages. I said what I wanted to say. Would I ever? I mean, if there was a good enough reason, I totally would. But I went back to Fairyland almost immediately. The last Fairyland book came out in 2016, and I wrote another Fairyland story after the election happened in 2016, and whichever way the election goes, I will probably be writing another one after this one. Yes, raises a glass to the lonely girls in the garden. We lonely girls can change the world sometimes. And hopefully, yes, we can leave the garden of this year's troubled before too long. It's all troubles and stories, and we have these brief moments where things are all right, and then it all goes moon-colored again. But I don't know. What a strange, solitary year this has been. This has been such a golden thread through it for me. Oh, we were all so lonely, Dana. God, I mean, we bookish people, most of us had lonely childhoods. So many of us did. It would have been nice if we could have all found each other then. I guess that's what the internet does now. I don't know. I've never been a child when the internet existed, but I don't know. I gotta get those 5 Fairyland movies done in an RPG. We've been trying to get a Fairyland movie happening for a long time. I don't know if it'll ever happen. We'll see. Your lips to Hollywood's ears. But yeah, stories do save us. Stories are the only things I know that save us. And not just stories in a book or on a screen, but just the stories we tell each other. I say this all the time when I go to schools, that even when you come to school in the morning and you tell your friends what you did over the weekend, you're telling a story about yourself. You're telling a story to connect you to other people's stories. That's all we do. It's all we do for our 100 years or less on this earth, that we just tell stories over and over and over again, and hope that where our stories end, others begin, and where ours begin, we remember the ones that end. We're just always trying to make this chain out of really poor materials, just breakable, fragile, beautiful materials. We're all just trying to connect to something, not just each other, but something. We want to believe that the chain goes on and is alive and goes backwards and forwards and is all of us. Oh, Becca's here too. I remember saying that at your school. I say the same thing sometimes, but the story of my life has become the story of my books. And every time somebody reads something that I wrote and connects to it, then that chain is alive, and it does go on, and it does go forward and back. And when I write, there are always things, little tiny things, from everybody I know. In space opera, there's a psychologist in Western Australia, and that was my Colin. There's little, we call them Easter eggs. Through all my books, but Easter eggs it's about resurrection and life. And every time an Easter egg hatches, something gets born again. And that's all I ever do, is I paint eggs and scatter them to be found. And long after I'm gone, people can go into the garden and find them. And I'll be there. And so will all the people I loved and I put into my stories. All the little things in the chain, all the little links. And as long as paper is a thing, and as long as digital files exist, my little painted eggs will go on. We'll all still be here. I'm sorry that I didn't actually end up being able to hold it together at all. I've been trying to not really lose it since last night, because I knew I had to do this tonight. And I wanted to smile for you. I wanted to not be a big blubbery mess. But I am. And there's a thing that I put at the end of Fairyland, and I only ever got to read it out loud once, because it's just at the very, very end. You don't read the very ends of books at readings. But I was doing a reading in North Carolina. I remember it was Asheville. And they asked me to just read something else. Nobody had ever done that before. Once I finished, a 35-minute reading, they said, just read something else, anything else. And I read it then. And if I thought that I was going to talk about this, I would have pulled out the Fairyland book and I'd read it now. But, the narrator of Fairyland gets to talk to the audience. That's the nice thing about it. And she says that whenever you're lonely, you can come back and visit me here in the pages of the book. And there will always be the kettle on, and biscuits, and a place by the fire. And there always will be, after I'm dust for 100 years. Not only will there be the pages of those books, but there'll be these videos. Nothing ever dies on the internet. Not our embarrassments, and not our beauties. And long after this terrible year is over, and long after I am nobody's memory, you'll be able to hit that little triangle and look at the red and gold leaves of this garden wall and remember that we spent these months together just trying to connect. That will always be there. We will always be together in this little room. And I love you all so much for having been here with me. And I wish that this year had never happened, so that we never would have done it. And I wish that it had all been over so fast that we wouldn't have even gotten to one stupid goose. But it did, and we did. And we tried to make something beautiful in the blitz, which is the most human thing you can do, really. Maybe the only human thing. So keep doing that. And remember all of these nights together in my fake firelight, but my real heart light. And I'll remember it too. I love you too. Do you think you'll do something like this again in the future, or continue posting on Instagram? I think so. I think we'll find something else. The unique thing about the Orphan's Tales was that there had never been an audiobook. So I, tried to do this. There isn't really anything else like that, but we'll find something. Whenever I signed In the Cities of Coin and Spice for people, I signed my name, but I also write, "No true tale ever ends." And it doesn't. We never end. Our stories never end. No proper story ever ends. So this won't end either. It'll just find another way. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I'm going to do my outro one last time. And then I will sign off. But I'll be over on Twitter and we can talk a little bit more. Thank you for putting up with my blubbering and my quivery chin and my sniffling. And thank you for these months. You've kept me sane. Knowing that I had to be here, I had to be with you, kept me going. So thank you. Thank you for that. For the last time. This has not been an audiobook of the Orphan's Tales. This has been a play. A long-running, critically acclaimed, one-woman show. You can find music based on these books at sjnugger.com. My solace, my sister. You can get copies anywhere books are sold, but I would ask that you get them from your local independent bookseller. You can find me on Twitter until the heat death of the universe, or Twitter, whichever comes first, at Cat Valente. You can find me on Patreon at Cat Valente, writing my dumb, moist heart onto a glowing screen every month. You can catch up. Well, not catch up anymore. You can listen on the archive, and you can listen forever at Cat Valente Live on YouTube. And hi to everybody who is watching this on YouTube in the future. A month from now, a week from now, a year from now, a decade from now. I hope everything turned out okay. I really hope everything turned out okay. We don't know yet, but I hope it did. And I hope you feel all the things that we felt all these months together in the dark. And if you want to toss a coin to your witch, at this point, you know how. There's a jar on my Instagram profile, my YouTube profile, my website, which is CatherynneValente.com. Thank you all so much. I love you all. If we are ever allowed to leave our homes again, come and find me at a convention and tell me you are one of us, you are one of these listeners, and I will give you the biggest hug any human being has ever given another. Thank you. I love you. Tell me a story.